There are a number of different factors that contribute to prejudice. I'm going to go down a list of these things that may not line up precisely with the list of factors that you'll find in the textbook, but if you add the textbook topics and my topics together, you'll have a pretty complete picture of the factors that contribute to prejudice. And I think you'll find that the two lists are pretty close. In a previous PowerPoint presentation, we learned about stereotyping, and at that time I said that the presence of stereotypes alone is not enough to cause prejudice, but you have to have stereotypes before you can have prejudice. So the presence of strong stereotypes is one of the things that contributes to a person being prejudiced. And the higher the individual is in social power, the more likely these stereotypes are going to come into play. Research has shown that people higher in social power don't need to think as much about individuals, and therefore they're more likely to think about people in aggregates, and therefore they'll rely on stereotyping even more than people that are low in social power. Also remember that I want you to think about prejudice as something that we will have some degree of. It's not that people are either prejudiced or unprejudiced, but think of it as a continuous dimension where at the one extreme you have an individual who's almost entirely free of prejudice, and at the other extreme you have a person who is extremely prejudiced, and most of us can fall somewhere along that line between the two extremes. The more of the factors on this list that are operating, the more likely the person is to be at the high end of the prejudice dimension. Certain personality traits seem to predispose an individual toward prejudice. For example, there's a trait called authoritarianism that reflects the degree to which a person is respectful of authority and deferential to authority figures. And if that person is in a position of authority, he or she expects others to react the same way and respect their authority. Well, research has consistently shown that people who score high in authoritarianism are also more likely to display prejudice than people who score low in authoritarianism. There's also a personality trait called the need for social approval. It's abbreviated on this slide as NAPP. And surprisingly, perhaps, people who score high in the need for social approval are often more prejudiced as well. And at first glance, this doesn't seem right, because if you want other people to approve of you, being prejudiced may not be the best way to make that happen. But if you think about fitting in a group, being accepted by the group, being approved of the others in that group, one of the ways in which you will do that is to embrace their standards, their norms, their beliefs, their worldview, to stay in their good graces. And if you're trying to gain approval from a group in which prejudiced attitudes are widely held, then you will embrace those prejudiced attitudes as well to show that you're part of the group. So the person high in the need for social approval is really trying to please other people, but in some situations they will think that pleasing other people means becoming prejudiced. There's also something called social dominance orientation. To what extent does a person seek to be influential or in control of what's going on in the group? People high in social dominance orientation are also more likely to display prejudice. One of the more controversial factors that has been studied over time is religious involvement. For a while, studies seemed to indicate that highly religious people were more likely to be prejudiced than people who were low in religiosity. But it turns out the relationship is a little trickier than that. What we now think is going on is that whether your religious convictions influence the degree to which you're prejudiced depends upon the nature of your religiosity. Researchers talk about something called intrinsic versus intrinsic religious involvement. A person who's intrinsically religiously involved really embraces the principles of his or her religious faith, and that person's religious identity is a central part of who they are. Extrinsic religious involvement, on the other hand, is a way of describing somebody who they go to church services, they do all the superficial things that make them look religious, but they don't really embrace the principles of their faith as a central part of their self identity. Well, it turns out extrinsically religious people are more likely to be prejudiced in general than intrinsically religious people. And for intrinsically religious people, whether they become prejudiced or not has a lot to do with what their religion has to say about different types of issues. So, for example, perhaps you're a member of a religion that preaches racial equality, which talks about the equality of human beings, how we should not discriminate against others based on ethnic background. Well, a person in this religious community may in fact harbor less racial prejudice than somebody who's not a member of that community. On the other hand, that very same religious community could be very intolerant of gay, lesbian individuals, and therefore this individual could be very prejudiced against people based on sexual orientation. So the nature of the prejudice one has can be influenced by one's religious involvement. Anyway, it's clear that your religious perspective is very much tied up with your tendency to be prejudiced or not, but the relationship is much more complicated than we once thought. The extent to which we make distinctions between in-groups and out-groups matters. In your textbook, this is referred to as prejudice being based on something called social identity theory. So if you derive your self-esteem from the group that you're a member of, then you're much more likely to be suspicious of out-group members. And the more we make this distinction between our in-group and out-groups, the stronger the tendency toward prejudice may be. A lot of things happen when we have this strong in-group identification. There are in-group biases where we think of our own in-group as having higher values, more morality, having God on your side. And if a person isn't part of your group, at best they're sort of unfortunate and misinformed and somebody to be felt sorry for. But at the other extreme, they can be outright thought of as evil. And so the degree to which you identify with your in-group translates into how much you don't like out-groups. And there's something called out-group homogeneity that occurs. People in our own groups are thought of as individuals, whereas we tend to lump everybody in out-groups together entirely. So if you were to ask somebody let's take a fraternity or a sorority as an example, what is the typical member of your fraternity like? You're probably going to get an answer along the lines of, well, gee, we have all kinds of different people in my fraternity. We're all individuals. We're not all the same. But if I ask you about a rival fraternity, the response is much more likely to be something like, oh, those guys, they're all the same. So our schema for thinking about in-group individuals is just more complicated than it is for outgroups. And outgroup members even look more alike, especially if the outgroup is based on race or some other characteristic. We find it harder to tell them apart, recognizing faces, for example. So, the degree to which we make a strong distinction between our in-group and other groups contributes to prejudice. This is especially true when there's competition for scarce resources. Prejudice is always strongest when times are tough and one perceives that there's not enough resources or opportunities to go around. And so you see a lot of anti-immigrant bias during times when the economy is weaker, for example. And we just do a lot of things when we process social information that leads us down the road toward prejudice. Our confirmation biases cause us to remember information that's consistent with what we believe. So when you meet somebody who matches your stereotype, you walk away from the interaction saying, well, I should have seen that coming, and you remember it. People who don't confirm your biases sort of get disregarded. They're kind of oddballs, and we don't incorporate them into our thinking. So we remember stuff that agrees with our preconceptions better than stuff that doesn't. And we're actively seeking to confirm that people in my own group are similar to me, but people in outgroups are not like me. So we're constantly seeking that kind of information to support our old ways of thinking. And our behavior can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies. So if you have a negative attitude about an individual from another group and you think these people are unfriendly and hostile, and so you start interacting with one of these individuals, you're on your guard, you're not being very friendly, and that person kind of responds to that by acting the same way. Well, you walk away from the interaction feeling vindicated. Aha, I knew they were like that. But in fact, it's your own behavior that caused the individual to behave that way. And finally, your textbook talks about something called scapegoating, which is our tendency to vent aggressive feelings against other people who are easy targets. In other words, we need somebody to blame for our misfortunes. And so if the economy's tough, for example, we try to find somebody who will bear the brunt of that. They could be immigrants. In Nazi Germany, it could be Jews. There are no shortage of scapegoats to be found in societies throughout the world. And scapegoats usually have certain things in common. They're usually socially acceptable targets. In other words, if you start saying negative things about them and attacking them, other people will remain silent and not object. They tend to be visible and easily identifiable. It's hard to scapegoat somebody if you can't tell who they are. So it's usually a group of people who dresses differently. They maybe have different religious practices that make them visible. They eat different foods. And in places like Nazi Germany, where it was sometimes difficult to tell who was Jewish and who was not, people were forced to wear a Star of David on their clothing so you could identify them easily at first glance. People that are selected for scapegoating are usually weak. And by weak, I don't mean personally or physically weak, but as a group, they just don't have a lot of power. They're not in charge of political power. They don't pull all the financial strings and so forth. And so people that we tend to scapegoat are people who are strange to us that we're predisposed to dislike anyway. And when you add all of these things together, this makes for a more prejudiced person. So if you have an individual who holds strong stereotypes, has the right personality traits, has the right kind of religious involvement, makes strong distinctions between their in-group and out-groups, especially during times of scarce resources, you're really setting the stage for an individual who's going to display quite a bit of prejudice. So let's talk a little bit about how to end prejudice. Obviously, I don't have all the answers to this, or I'd be out collecting my Nobel Peace Prize. But certainly, one of the places we need to start is with the socialization of children. Many of our attitudes about people develop as we're growing up, and the subtle messages that kids get from their parents, their teachers, from the media, build prejudice over the course of a lifetime. There's an excellent, rather long video associated with this part of the course called A Class Divided, about a famous experiment done in an Iowa elementary school to give kids the experience of prejudice. And if you have the time, I strongly recommend that you view it, but it's not essential to do well on the test, but I think you'll find it very interesting. So, we have to be careful about the messages we send to kids. And this can start with something as simple as how we portray different types of people in kids' books. To take gender stereotypes as an example, if you look at a book like Richard Scarry's Busy, Busy Town, you see a story about a small town where you kind of go through the town and meet different characters, and you meet the butcher, you meet the TV repairman, you meet the mayor, the police officer, the teacher. Anyway, something very subtle in a book like this is that almost all of the important characters are males. The mayor, the police chief, the owners of most of the businesses, they're all male characters. There are far fewer female characters, and of them, most of them are children or mothers. The only people holding jobs in scary, busy town are the elementary school teacher and the librarian. Otherwise, you get these very sex typed stories about here's what men do, here's what women do. Another place where kids get subtle messages about the differences between little boys and little girls, and hence men and women, is through the commercials that they see on television. On this slide, there are links to a number of different TV commercials for toys aimed at either boys or girls. Some of them are kind of old, and the stereotypes are very blatant, but some of them are not quite so old. So just for fun, take a look at some of these and see what kinds of messages little girls and little boys are receiving about what it means to be male or female. And it isn't just commercials aimed at kids that send not so subtle messages about the kinds of things that men and women should be doing or what they should be worrying about. Another case in point. And of course, prejudices of all kind can be communicated subtly or not so subtly through the messages that advertisements send. So let's summarize sort of the best we can come up with for how to start working on ending prejudice. We've already talked about socialization, so doing our best to give kids appropriate messaging when they're growing up to prevent the growth of prejudice. As a society, we need to cultivate anti-prejudice social norms. At the very least, you need to make it uncool to publicly display prejudice. As much as possible, removing cues that divide people, constantly signaling who the in-group and who the out-group are, ways of reducing the we-they mentality and getting us to think more in terms of us. There used to be this naive assumption that if you just brought people together, prejudice would go away as they got to know each other. And it's not quite that simple. Yes, intergroup contact is essential, but it's best if it occurs under certain circumstances, when the people that you're bringing together are at least somewhat equal in power. Otherwise, the differences between them become even more apparent. They need to come together in situations where they're working for the same common goals. It's important to meet people who differ from your stereotypes, and it's really helpful if the contact that you have with them is very informal, day-to-day, unexceptional, where you really do get to know the people and think of them as part of normal everyday life. And absolutely, we have to have social norms favoring equality. So, once again, do what you can to reduce the we-they mentality, but it's a tough task. I've got to say, I still think this is one of the most serious problems societies need to deal with.